Okay, we're back, and as you can see here, this talk is going to discuss the Food and Agriculture Science Enhancement Grants, and this is a particular grant type that's offered in AFRI. So this is the instance where we're going to be talking very specifically about a particular grant program, and there's a number of aspects of this that you may be interested in, especially if you're from an institution that can obtain strengthening awards, strengthening grants, or you're a young investigator or a new scientist or something like that. And the other point to note, due to a sort of last-minute scheduling change, a personal matter, Dr. Lynn could not come to North Carolina A&T this week. So in his stead, Mary Peet has graciously offered, so to speak, to provide, to give you his slides and answer as many questions as possible. If we do run into a really thorny question that we think we really want to try to answer, I will get him on the phone. He is in his office pending his personal matters, and so we can do that if we need to. I already introduced Mary, but again, she's the division director at NIFA, and she is going to tell us everything she learned about FASE grants.
Okay, thanks, Dan. How's the sound in back or on the video? It's good? Up a bit? Yeah, okay. This is always challenging, the after lunch meeting, and especially with no coffee, but we'll see how we do here. I think the first thing, NIFA grants are pretty confusing. Edwin Lewis went through some grant programs. These are other grant programs. So you all are sitting out there either in this room or somewhere out in Webland, I guess, one of the 400, saying, does this grant apply to me? Am I eligible to apply for this program? What's in it for me? So I'm going to try to answer that sort of before I get into a lot of the intricacies of the program. Okay, so there are some groups of people that definitely should be interested in these food and agricultural science enhancement grants. One of those groups is anybody who's interested in a fellowship for either pre-doctoral or postdoctoral work, because that is one of the types of FASE grants. So pretty much anybody interested in graduate education should be interested. Another group that should be thinking about this is the new investigators. Now, new investigator is a category generally refers to people that are, well, assistant professors, postdocs, 5 years, within 5 years of their PhD degree. So that's another group that should pay attention to these FASE grants. So that's two groups. The other group that should pay attention to these are people that are submitting to our AFRI programs. Now, I know there are a lot of acronyms that you hear when NIFA gives their grantsmanship program. AFRI is our Agriculture and Food Research Initiative. Some of you may be familiar with the National Research Initiative, which was the predecessor. Some of you might have heard about the foundational grants, or you might hear about the challenge area grants. So as Dan said, these FASE grants are mostly a subcategory of the AFRI grants. So I hate to use two acronyms in one sentence, but I think I've defined them anyway. There are going to be 3 important slides in this presentation and only 15 altogether. The first one is possibly the most important because it's the person that you can contact for more information, and that's Liang Lin. There are a number of people involved with the FASE program because they're really running under all the separate programs. But Liang's certainly very familiar with them. His phone number, and I guess he's standing by to receive your calls, just like on the shopping networks, 202-401-5045. And the email is llin@nifa.usda.gov. So for your questions, I guess, during the presentation or afterwards, he would be a good contact. The next slide on FASE grants is also important. I'm going to leave it up a little while just to emphasize that these FASE grants, in addition to the fellowships, are a category within the AFRI grants. So somebody earlier today talked about set-aside money. So probably these FASE grants are the set-aside money that that individual was referring to. Somebody else talked about seed grants, and seed grants are one of the FASE grant types. So they're different from the programs that Edwin Lewis talked about. They are specific to AFRI, the Agriculture and Food Research Initiative. So the idea is to strengthen science capabilities in research, education, or extension. The idea is to help institutions develop competitive scientific programs. So, well, okay, so which institutions? Like, you're asking yourself, does this relate to my institution? Possibly. Somebody asked about Alabama. Alabama would be one of the institutions that can benefit from FASE grants. Minority serving institutions that Edwin was discussing can also benefit from FASE grants. It's sort of a set-aside. And of course, anybody that's interested in the fellowships for the predoctoral or the postdoctoral programs would also benefit, as well as new investigators. I hate to spend too much time on the AFRI grant types, but I feel like I need to at least show one grant. Most people, when you think about submitting a grant, what you're thinking about is a standard, what we call our standard grant. These are the ones that, they're 18 pages and they can't be too long, and you have to put all the stuff in them. Those are the standard grants. They can be either research, either education, or extension, or they can be integrated. Another type of grant that is part of the AFRI program and is submitted along with the same deadline are the conference grants. And these are, I think, sort of an exciting type of grant. They're a little bit smaller. They can be funded even before the panel meets. So if you have a neat idea for a conference, submit it at the same deadlines, and it can be funded on a sort of a rotating schedule. And then the FASE grants are really the third type. So, but they're a little complicated because even within the FASE grants, there are a number of different types. So one of them, I mentioned earlier, the predoctoral fellowship grants. Now these by predoctoral, well, I guess this is fairly obvious. They're for people that are trying to get their PhD. The eligibility, you have to have taken your qualifying exams, so they're usually, students would be at least a year into the program. So the timing is a little challenging on these. So the predoctoral ones, you can get a couple years of funding to finish up your PhD, but you do have to sort of already be accepted into the program. These are a relatively new type for NIFA. They started with the 2008 Farm Bill. The postdoctoral grants we've had for a number of years, and those are a little more straightforward. The new investigator grants are really a subset within the standard grant. So the thing to remember about new investigators is if you think you are a new investigator within 5 years of your PhD, when you go through that first grant sheet to check off all that applies, make sure you check off the little box that says new investigator, because if you do that, you can be considered for the grant, and it'll give you a little bit of an extra push in eligibility. And remember, this doesn't apply to any of the Farm Bill programs. It doesn't apply to the 406 programs. It only applies to the AFRI programs because those are the ones that have the set-aside. Okay, so there are also a number of different types of strengthening grants, which are a little different than the standard grants. There's the seed grants, sabbatical grants, equipment grants, and then strengthening standard grants. The program is sometimes called a set-aside because for the total AFRI budget, which last year was $264 million, about 10% is set aside for these strengthening grants. So, of course, that's a pretty good chunk of change. That would be, well, $26.4 million for this type of grant. Just for the fellowships this year, it'll be $6 million in fellowships. And by the way, the fellowship RFA for 2013 has just come out. Letters of intent are due January 3rd. So you are in time to hear about this and get your letter of intent in. The actual deadline is early March. So that's one that's coming right up for once the timing is good on these grantsmanship workshops. The fellowship program has its own deadline for the rest of these, the standard strengthening grants. You would just go with whatever the program deadline is. For most of the foundational programs, the letter of intent deadline is passed, so it's too late to apply for those now, but we'll have of course, there's always next year, and the challenge area grants will be coming out before too long. So anyway, of the total AFRI budget, which again was $264 this year, 2.5% is earmarked for the fellowships, and 7.5% is earmarked for these strengthening grants. So again, it's a good chunk of money. Specifically on the pre-doctoral fellowships, again, it's a good amount of money for someone that's needs a couple more years and some more money to finish up their postdoc. $75,000 for 2 years. You can use that money for a stipend, for tuition, for fees, fringe benefits, supplies, or travel. So it's pretty flexible. These can be research grants or education grants. The applicants have to submitted or completed and document that they've passed their qualifying exam. You have to be a U.S. citizen, national, or permanent resident. Postdoctorals, similar, a little more money, $130,000 for 2 years. Again, salary, fringe benefits, supplies, travel, publication. Again, similar criteria. You have to have your doctoral degree not necessarily at the time you submit it, but you have to know that it's coming on soon. And that's a separate panel, and that's the one that's coming up with the LOIs in January. Okay, so this is slide number 6 for those of you that are following along separately. The new investigator grants. These are for, again, people with less than 5 years experience. The idea is you haven't already received a whole lot of big federal grants, which generally if you're 5 years you probably haven't. There's not a specific RFA for these new investigator grants. You would apply to whatever program that you're interested in, whether it's foundational or challenge area, and just submit to that program. But again, check on the submission form that you are a new investigator. Occasionally, even if somebody doesn't check it, but the panel identifies them as a new investigator, they might qualify for it, but it's certainly better to put it on the form that you submit. So that's the new investigator ones. The strengthening grants, this is where it gets a little complicated, so I'll show a flow chart at the end, and also at the end of each of the AFRI RFAs. There's a flow chart that goes into this in more detail. The types of strengthening grants that you can apply for, or the seed grants that someone mentioned earlier, could also apply for sabbatical grants or a strengthening grant, but as part of a standard application. So the eligibility for the FASE programs outside of the fellowships are limited to the EPSCoR states, and I'll define EPSCoR in a minute, but they're basically states that, at least numerically, haven't gotten their fair share of federal funding in the past. And the other group that would be eligible to apply for strengthening grants are people from small or mid-sized universities. And a small or mid-sized university is defined as enrollment under 17,500. And again, there's the list of these. Also, minority serving degree granting institutions is another category that can submit for these strengthening grants. And then there's another category, and I'm not quite clear how this is, but it is listed in the RFAs, are institutions which have had limited success in submitting or getting funding from AFRI during the previous years. So EPSCoR, again, is pretty straightforward. There's a list. These are recalculated each year. So for 2013, see, Alabama's right here. And it's not necessarily the states you would expect. Connecticut is usually one of the EPSCoR states. Maine. Notice North Carolina is not one of the EPSCoR states. North Carolina is getting its fair share, at least according to the statistics. But South Carolina, Rhode Island, Virginia is also getting its fair share, according to these statistics. Okay, so there are other eligible states. Maybe in our viewing area, we have someone from American Samoa, District of Columbia, Guam, Micronesia, Puerto Rico, Virgin Islands, or the Northern Marianas. And these are all eligible to submit for these strengthening grants. So I know this is a confusing grant, but it's sort of a graph, but it sort of makes the point that the EPSCoR states change each year. You go up here to Alabama, it is actually qualified as an EPSCoR state from 2003, well, the last 10 years, basically. And Alaska has also qualified all those years. Montana really only qualified sort of, I guess that's 2011 to 2012. So states move in and out of eligibility. For Vermont, West Virginia, and Wyoming, they've qualified for most years. But again, the list is on each RFA, so it's fairly straightforward if you are or are not in one of the EPSCoR states. So again, just the definition of the small and mid-sized, current total enrollment of 17,500 or less. And again, there are lists of the actual student, student body, minority serving. So the idea is the minority group exceeds 50% of total enrollment to be officially minority serving. And then this limited institutional success, there's a table in the RFA that shows which institutions could qualify under this limited institutional success group. Okay, so these are people who are or institutions that are eligible for strengthening grants. So you can be eligible for a grant either based on sort of where you are in your academic career, like needing a fellowship or being a new investigator, or you can qualify on the basis of your institution. So there are really two ways you can qualify. Okay, so if you do qualify, and again, I'll go through this on a flow chart at the end, there are a number of different types of grants that you can apply for. Somebody had mentioned earlier the seed grants. These seed grants can go up to $150,000, and that's for a 2-year period of time. That's not that much each year. That's that much to be allocated over 2 years. Somebody had asked, I think the question this morning was whether these seed grants could also be integrated. The restriction is they are supposed to be a single function grant, but they can be either research or education or extension. But the idea is, since it's a small amount of money, and usually for a focused project, that you wouldn't necessarily have an integrated program for that. Sabbatical grants, these can be up to 1 year of salary, funds for travel and supplies, mini sabbaticals. You can also apply for mini sabbaticals. Sometimes we get a question about whether you can apply for international travel as part of these sabbaticals, and you can. Again, I would say they need to be reasonable requests. So if it looks like it's too much of a junket, panels will get turned off. But certainly, as long as it's well documented, international sabbaticals could be also considered. So equipment grants. The idea on the equipment grant is, again, this is strengthening. So whatever the cost of the equipment is, we could pay up to 50% of the cost, but no more than $50,000 total. So if it's a big piece of equipment and your institution is eligible, you could apply for 50% of the cost of that for one piece of equipment. You can have, it requires non-federal matching, but you can get waivers for some institutions, and again, there's a table on that. For these type of grants, it's only a 7-page grant, a project narrative. So that's a shorter grant. The regular grants, or we call it standard grants, are 18 pages. So this is a shorter grant because you're asking for something very specific. Okay, now the strengthening standard grants, I think that's a lot of what people are thinking about when they talk about set-asides. This can be research, education, and/or extension, pretty much the same criteria as the other grants in a particular program. So it's the same, 18 pages, but when you apply, make sure that you check the box indicating that your institution is eligible. So again, for the new investigator and for the strengthening, make sure you know if your institution is eligible, check that box when you submit. So the panel manager might or the national program leader might or might not know that your institution is eligible. So no specific RFA for any of these strengthening grants. You just identify the AFRI topic for the proposal you're interested in and submit to that program by the deadline. We just passed the deadline for the foundational groups, foundational programs in plant health, protection, and plant products group, which is one for my division. And these are, by the way, very hard deadlines. They're hard deadlines for the letters of intent in the AFRI programs, and they're hard deadlines for the actual proposals. So when it says 5 o'clock Eastern Time, it means 5 o'clock Eastern Time. And it doesn't mean 5:05 or anything like that. And that part is true also for pretty much all the NIFA grants. So again, there's not a specific panel for the strengthening grants. They're reviewed along with all the other standard grants in the same panel. So So what's the advantage? Where is this set aside? How is it going to actually help? How's it going to help you if you're qualified? Well, basically, it helps you because you sort of get an extra shot at getting funding for your program. As you know, pretty much all the NIFA programs are extremely competitive. We have only a few percentage in my program last year in my division for the plant biology program. We funded only 3 or 4% of the projects. We didn't even fund all the ones rated outstanding. So these are very competitive programs. When you submit as an F score or a minority serving, your proposal is ranked along with all the other proposals. People don't even necessarily know that it's from an F score institution or a minority serving institution or anything like that. So after it goes through the paneling process, if your proposal was good enough to rank number 1 and within the funding cutoff, so those are the ones that are ranked high enough by the panels that they're actually going to be funded, then you're good to go. You're going to get your grant. If you didn't make that cutoff, and a couple people mentioned earlier about projects that just fall below the cutoffs, well, the advantage of having the F score eligibility or the minority serving eligibility is you get an extra shot because there's a certain percentage of funds set aside to fund specifically proposals from F score or minority serving or the other categories that I mentioned. Okay, so they'll support a certain number with most of the money, the 92.5. But then other strengthening proposals, the highest rated ones, there's another 7.5% of funds for that program that can go toward those grants. There's not really a set-aside grant for new investigators, but again, it's always worth checking because a proposal, if there are a couple that are really close, the new investigator one might be moved up in priority if it was a really good proposal from a new investigator. So it's always good to check that box if it applies. Now, we do rank the seed, sabbatical, and equipment grants separately. And again, that comes with the set-aside money. So, okay, so this is the flow chart that sort of explains everything that I've gone through so far. And I know you can't really see it from there, but it is, when you look at the AFRI RFA, this is on the final page, usually, of the AFRI RFA. So you can work through it. Basically, what it's saying here is the first criteria, do you have an appointment at a degree-granting institution? Well, that's going to be most people probably in the room, or a state experiment station. So probably if you don't have either of those things, you're not going to be eligible to apply. But I would say most people make this criteria. Okay, so if it's yes here, then the next cutoff is whether you're eligible for EPSCoR states. So if your state is one of them on the chart of EPSCoR, like Alabama, again in my example, you are eligible here. So you can stop looking at this chart. On the other hand, if you're from North Carolina, for example, which is not an EPSCoR state, then you have to work a little harder. So you say no here for EPSCoR. Okay, so then it says, are you at a minority serving institution? And these are all defined. So if you say no, so say you're at Elon College, just to give an example. Elon would be a degree-granting institution. It's a degree-granting institution, so it's eligible here. It's not eligible for EPSCoR because it's in North Carolina. It's not minority serving, so it's not going to go here, but it is a small or mid-sized institution, it's under, so I don't know what the tuition is, but I'm pretty sure it would be under, or Guilford College, one of those. It would be under the 17,500. So then you would come down here, and if your answer is no, because maybe you're NC State instead, then you're not eligible. That's the end. If your institution is small, but it's still really successful, then you could still be not eligible. But if your institution is small and heretofore not successful, then you might be, then you would be eligible. So you say it's sort of a complicated flow chart, but there are tables listing all these. So coming back again with the A&T example, they are minority serving, but you still have this criteria about who's most successful and who's less successful. So anyway, so there are many tables that you need to figure out to decide if you're eligible or not. And I think I've now run to the end of my time, so maybe I manage not to have to take any questions. What do you think, Dan?
Do we have any? There's 3 questions, and because you ran over, we're going to make you answer them. And we're going to make them harder than what they appear.
You have a good way of doing that, Dan. I've been admiring that through the day.
And I know I don't think anybody has this data, but I'm going to ask it anyway. What percentage of FASE grants go to new investigators?
Yeah.
I don't even know if Liang could answer that one, so you're off the hook.
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, it's one of these things that it's definitely worthwhile self-identifying as the new investigator, but you would have to be the PD. You know, it's not, if you're just a co-PD, you would have to be the PD on the grant to really get that extra benefit from the new investigator. I've heard panel discussions, and you know, it does sometimes bring a grant up, but what the percentage would be, I don't know.
Okay, here's one, and well, it's sort of a 2-part. I'm wondering if researchers in non-eligible institutions can be co-PIs for a seed grant proposal. And then the second part is, if yes, is there any limitation for allocating budget? And if it is yes, it's the same 50% allocation rule that we talked about before. Can you answer the first part?
Well, really, most of these criteria go by the PD, so it's really going to be the PD that determines eligibility versus non-eligibility. And if there are other co-PDs, it sort of doesn't matter where they come from. But if you have some specific question on that, you probably call Liang, or actually the better person to call is whoever the program contact is for the program you're interested in.
And the final one, and I know you know this one.
That's good.
There's no pressure here. Is a letter of intent required for strengthening grants? I think you did mention that.
Yeah.
Except
so
for the conference ones, right? Do we need?
Well,
we don't think we need a letter of intent for the conference grants, but otherwise
no,
everything else.
Yeah.
Okay, so you kind of know it.
Sometimes people do. The thing with the conference grant is you don't necessarily have to wait for the panel. So a lot of times, as soon as the RFA opens, people will just go ahead and submit their conference grant. As soon as the RFA comes out, you can put in your conference grant proposal, because a lot of times you want to have your conference at a specific time, so you really need to find out one way or another soon. So mostly conferences don't require the letter of intent, but you can still turn it in. Yeah?
Yeah, one thing that, at least based on my experience, is kind of waste of time is many of these grants that require cost sharing, because we run into a lot of problems getting that money. Another thing is that I'm not, despite all the maze and the flowcharts, I'm not clear. from A&T, can you write a seed grant? Or can you not write a seed grant?
Oh, you would make it specific. Well, going back to the flow chart, this is a minority serving institution. So that part would be yes. But then you would have to look at the table that breaks down the more successful and the less successful minority serving institutions. So, but you just look it up on the RFA, and it will tell you whether you would qualify for that. The cost share, well, I guess SCRI is the main one that has the cost share, and we don't have the strengthening grants in any of the Farm Bill programs. So it's sort of, but that's not the cost share you were talking about. You were talking about the one for equipment grants where you have to have non-federal funds for half the equipment. Oh, okay, good, good. Well, I'm... Okay, so yeah, your institution is probably the best one to really talk to about that, whether you qualify.
I was just going to say, it hasn't come up today, but that's a perfect example. Talk to your sponsored programs office. Those are the first people you want to contact at your institution when you have any of these questions. And then if they can't answer it, then ask us, because oftentimes they've been through this before and they know the answer.
Yeah, and just to repeat that, I guess you were saying A&T does qualify for the seed grants, but on the equipment grants you don't qualify for the waiver of matching. So again, your institution should have that information. Thank you.
Thank you, Mary. We're going to move on to the final presentation.
Okay, thank you, Liang.